All right, let's get right into it. We're about to unpack one of history's most haunting, most tragic cold cases. It's a story about two royal children, two princes, who walked into what was supposed to be the most secure fortress in all of England, and then they just vanished.
The basic facts are just chillingly simple. We're talking about the summer of 1483. Two young princes are seen playing in the gardens of the Tower of London. And then, by the fall, nothing. They're gone. And when I say gone, I mean gone. They were never seen alive again. No bodies, no confession, not a single good explanation.
And you gotta remember, these weren't just any kids. The victims here were Edward V, who was only 12 years old, but was already the uncrowned King of England, and with him his little brother, 9-year-old Richard, the Duke of York. These boys were the heirs to the entire kingdom. So, that brings us right to the heart of the mystery, doesn't it? It's the one question that has absolutely haunted historians for more than 500 years, and it's the one we're going to dig into right now. What on earth happened to those two boys inside the walls of the Tower of London? Okay, so to really get a grip on this mystery, we have to rewind a little bit. You know, you can't understand the crime without understanding the absolute chaos that set the stage for it. This whole story really kicks off not with a murder, but with a sudden death that plunged the entire kingdom into crisis. And look, the speed at which all this happened is just mind-blowing. On April 9th, King Edward IV suddenly dies. Less than a month later, his brother, Richard, intercepts the new young king, Edward V, on his way to the capital. By May, Edward is put in the Tower of London, for safekeeping before his coronation. Then, in mid-June, his little brother Richard is brought there too, supposedly to keep him company. Think about that. In just over 2 months, both heirs to the throne are completely locked away. And the guy orchestrating all of this? Well, he had every right to. He was Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the boys' own uncle. He'd been given the title Lord Protector. Now, what that means is he was basically the acting ruler, the regent, while the king was too young to rule. And that gave him total legal control over the kingdom and, this is the crucial part, over the young king himself. So, once he had the boys safely tucked away, Richard made his big move. And it was just this incredibly slick 3-step power grab. First, he stands up and accuses his own dead brother, the former king, of being secretly married to another woman. It's a shocking claim. Second, he uses that accusation to ram an act through Parliament, this thing called Titulus Regius, which officially declared the princes illegitimate. And boom, step 3, with the real heirs now legally out of the picture, he steps right up and claims the crown for himself. And you can just imagine the terror the boys must have felt. Once their uncle became king, they were moved deeper into the tower, seen less and less. There's this one really chilling account from an Italian diplomat who was in London at the time. He reported that a doctor who saw the young Edward said the boy was spending his days in prayer and confession, describing him as being, quote, like a victim prepared for sacrifice. Just wow. Okay, so the boys have vanished. A king and his heir gone without a trace. The big question is, who's responsible? It's time to line up the suspects and look at who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to pull this off. So, suspect number 1. Look, there's no getting around it. The prime suspect, both back then and today, is the guy who had the most to gain. Their uncle, the man who took their crown and became King Richard III. And honestly, the case against Richard is pretty straightforward. Let's break it down. Motive? Even though he declared them illegitimate, those boys were a living, breathing threat to his rule. They were a symbol for anyone who wanted to challenge him. Opportunity? He had total, absolute control of the tower. They were his prisoners. And the evidence? Well, whispers that he'd murdered them started almost immediately, spreading all across Europe. And this wasn't just propaganda cooked up later. This was happening while he was still on the throne. But Richard wasn't the only one with keys to the castle, so to speak. There's another major player we need to look at. Let's talk about suspect number 2, his right-hand man, a very powerful nobleman named Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. Now, Buckingham is a really interesting suspect. He was Richard's biggest supporter, right? He helped him seize the throne. But then, just a few months later, he turns around and leads a rebellion against Richard, gets caught, and is executed. So his motive is, well, it's pretty unclear. But as Richard's key ally, he definitely could have had the opportunity. And here's the kicker. A document from that time, discovered much, much later, seems to pin the murder on, quote, the vice of the Duke of Buckingham. Very compelling stuff. All right, that brings us to our third and final major suspect,
This is the man who would ultimately win the whole game, the guy who defeated Richard in battle, took the throne, and started the famous Tudor dynasty. Henry Tudor, later known as King Henry VII.
Now, the theory here is all about timing. Henry Tudor, for sure, had a motive. I mean, if those princes were secretly still alive when he became king in 1485, their claim to the throne would have been way stronger than his. But, and this is a huge but, his opportunity is a major problem. He wasn't even in England when the boys disappeared 2 years earlier. The case against him is all circumstantial, based on what might have happened later. So, we've got our lineup of suspects, but no smoking gun. For centuries, the entire story has basically hinged on two famous but deeply flawed pieces of evidence: a supposed confession and a mysterious box of bones.
This right here, this is the story that everyone knows, mostly because Shakespeare made it famous. It comes from a history written decades after the fact by Sir Thomas More. He claims that a night, a guy named Sir James Tyrrell eventually confessed. The story goes that he didn't do the deed himself, but had his men sneak in at night and smother the sleeping princes with their pillows. It's an absolutely gruesome, vivid account.
But, and this is a big but, there's a huge problem with this confession. It almost certainly never actually happened. I mean, there's no original document of it, anywhere. It was written down more than 40 years later. No one else writing at the time mentions it. And here's the real clincher. King Henry VII, the man who defeated Richard, had every reason in the world to prove he was a monster. Yet he never, not once, used this supposed confession as official proof. That tells you a lot. So that brings us to the bones. Fast forward almost 200 years to 1674. Some construction workers are tearing out a staircase in the Tower of London, and they find a wooden box. Inside, two small skeletons. Well, the king at the time, Charles II, basically just assumed Thomas More's story was true. He declared them to be the long-lost princes and had them properly buried in Westminster Abbey. But you have to realize that was an identification based entirely on a story, not a shred of science. And even when they finally did bring science into it, way later, in 1933, the results were just frustrating. On the one hand, yeah, the ages of the skeletons seemed about right for the princes. But on the other hand, the skeletons weren't complete. They were weirdly mixed in with some animal bones, and the final official conclusion was inconclusive. They couldn't prove who they were. So could they be the princes? Maybe, but we just don't know for sure. So after you peel back all those layers, centuries of propaganda, rumors, and shaky evidence, what are we actually left with? Well, it all boils down to an unsolved mystery, a giant puzzle where the tiny number of facts we actually have are just swallowed up by this huge sea of unknowns. I mean, just look at the difference here. What we know for certain you could write on a napkin. The princes went into the tower in 1483, they were declared illegitimate, they disappeared from public view, they were never seen alive again. That's it. What we don't know is, well, everything else. How they died, when they died, who killed them, and where their bodies really are. Every single crucial detail is just gone. And you know that massive empty space has been filled with theories for half a millennium. You've got the classic, Richard III murdered them for the crown. But then you've got solid arguments that the Duke of Buckingham did it on his own, or that Henry VII cleaned up loose ends after he took power. Some people even think they just died of natural causes, and the whole thing was covered up badly. And yeah, there are even those theories that one or both of them somehow escaped. And so, in the end, we're left with this powerful, tragic thought. For two young boys, Edward and Richard, being born with royal blood was supposed to be a guarantee of a crown. Instead, it was a death sentence. Their story is just this stark reminder that history isn't always neat and tidy. And it leaves us with a really tough question. How do you tell a story when the final, most important chapter is missing?